Hello, everyone, and welcome back to our reading of The Travels of Marco Polo. Today's chapter, Book 1, Chapter 1. Let's get started. It should be known to the reader that at the time when Baldwin II was Emperor of Constantinople, where a magistrate representing the Doge of Venice then resided, and in the year of our Lord 1250, Niccolo Polo, the father of the said Marco, and Maffeo, the brother of Niccolo, respectable and well-informed men, embarked in a ship of their own, with a rich and varied cargo of merchandise, and reached Constantinople in safety. After mature deliberation on the subject of the proceedings, it was determined, as the measure most likely to improve their trading capital, that they should prosecute their voyage into the Euxine or Black Sea. With this view, they made purchases of many fine and costly jewels, and taking their departure from Constantinople, navigated that sea to a port named Saldaea, from whence they travelled on horseback many days until they reached the court of a powerful chief of the western Tartars, named Barca, who dwelt in the cities of Bulgara and Asara, and had the reputation of being one of the most liberal and civilized princes hitherto known amongst the tribes of Tartary. He expressed much satisfaction at the arrival of these travelers, and received them with marks of distinction. In return for which courtesy, when they had laid before him the jewels they brought with them, and perceived that their beauty pleased him, they presented them for his acceptance. The liberality of this conduct on the part of the two brothers struck him with admiration, and being unwilling that they should surpass him in generosity, he not only directed double the value of the jewels to be paid to them, but made them in addition several rich presents. The brothers having resided a year in the dominion of this prince, they became desirous of revisiting their native country, but were impeded by the sudden breaking out of a war between him and another chief named Alau, who ruled over the eastern Tartars. In a fierce and very sanguinary battle that ensued between the respective armies, Alau was victorious, in consequence of which, the roads being rendered unsafe for travelers, the brothers could not attempt to return by the way they came, and it was recommended to them, as the only practicable mode of reaching Constantinople, to proceed in an easterly direction by an unfrequented route, so as to skirt the limits of Barca's territories. Accordingly, they made their way to a town named Ukaka, situated on the confines of the kingdom of the Western Tartars. Leaving that place and advancing still further, they crossed the Tigris, one of the four rivers of paradise, and came to a desert, the extent of which was 17 days' journey, wherein they found neither town, castle, nor any substantial building, but only Tartars with their herds dwelling in tents on the plain. Having passed this tract, they arrived at length at a well-built city called Bokhara, in a province of that name, belonging to the dominions of Persia, and the noblest city of that kingdom, but governed by a prince whose name was Barak. Here, from inability to proceed further, they remained 3 years. It happened while these brothers were in Bokhara that a person of consequence and gifted with eminent talents made his appearance there. He was proceeding as ambassador from Alau, before mentioned, to the Grand Khan, supreme chief of all the Tartars, named Kublai, whose residence was at the extremity of the continent in a direction between northeast and east. Not having ever before had an opportunity, although he wished it, of seeing any natives of Italy, he was gratified in a high degree at meeting and conversing with these brothers, who had now become proficients in the Tartar language, and after associating with them for several days and finding their manners agreeable to him, he proposed to them that they should accompany him to the presence of the great Khan, who would be pleased by their appearance at his court, which had not hitherto been visited by any person from their country, adding assurances that they would be honorably received and recompensed with many gifts. Convinced as they were that their endeavors to return homeward would expose them to the most imminent risks, they agreed to this proposal, and recommending themselves to the protection of the Almighty, they set out on their journey in the suite of the ambassador, attended by several Christian servants, whom they had brought with them from Venice. The course they took at first was between the northeast and north, and an entire year was consumed before they were enabled to reach the imperial residence in consequence of the extraordinary delays occasioned by the snows and the swelling of the rivers, which obliged them to halt until the former had melted and the floods had subsided. Many things worthy of admiration were observed by them in the progress of their journey, but which are here omitted, as they will be described by Marco Polo in the sequel of the book. Being introduced to the presence of the Grand Khan Hublai, the travelers were received by him with a condescension and affability that belonged to his character, and as they were the first Latins who had made their appearance in that country, they were entertained with feasts and honored with other marks of distinction. Entering graciously into conversation with them, he made earnest inquiries on the subject of the western parts of the world, of the Emperor of the Romans, and of other Christian kings and princes. He wished to be informed of their relative consequence, the extent of their possessions, the manner in which justice was administered in their several kingdoms and principalities, how they conducted themselves in warfare, and above all, he questioned them particularly respecting the Pope, the affairs of the Church, and the religious worship and doctrine of the Christians. Being well instructed and discreet men, they gave appropriate answers upon all these points, and as they were perfectly acquainted with the Tartar language, they expressed themselves always in becoming terms, insomuch that the Grand Khan, holding them in high estimation, frequently commanded their attendance. When he had obtained all the information that the two brothers communicated with so much good sense, he expressed himself well satisfied, and having formed in his mind the design of employing them as his ambassadors to the Pope, after consulting with his ministers on the subject, he proposed to them, with many kind entreaties, that they should accompany one of his officers named Hogatal on a mission to the See of Rome. His object, he told them, was to make a request to His Holiness that he would send to him 100 men of learning, thoroughly acquainted with the principles of the Christian religion, as well as with the 7 arts, and qualified to prove to the learned of his dominions by just and fair argument that the faith professed by Christians is superior to and founded upon more evident truth than any other, that the gods of the Tartars and the idols worshipped in their houses were only evil spirits, and that they and the people of the East in general were under an error in reverencing them as divinities. He moreover signified his pleasure that upon their return they should bring with them from Jerusalem some of the holy oil from the lamp which is kept burning over the sepulchre of our Lord Jesus Christ, whom he professed to hold in veneration and to consider as the true God. Having heard these commands addressed to them by the Grand Khan, they humbly prostrated themselves before him, declaring their willingness and instant readiness to perform to the utmost of their ability whatever might be the royal will. Upon which he caused letters in the Tartarian language to be written in his name to the Pope of Rome, and these he delivered into their hands. He likewise gave orders that they should be furnished with a golden tablet displaying the imperial cipher, according to the usage established by His Majesty, in virtue of which the person bearing it, together with his whole suite, are safely conveyed and escorted from station to station by the governors of all places within the imperial dominions, and are entitled, during the time of their residing in any city, castle, town, or village, to a supply of provisions and everything necessary for their accommodation. Being thus honorably commissioned, they took their leave of the Grand Khan and set out on their journey, but had not proceeded more than 20 days when the officer named Hogatal, their companion, fell dangerously ill in a city named Alau. In this dilemma, it was determined upon consulting all who were present and with the approbation of the man himself that they should leave him behind. In the prosecution of their journey, they derived essential benefit from being provided with a royal tablet, which procured them attention in every place through which they passed. Their expenses were defrayed and escorts were furnished. But, notwithstanding these advantages, so great were the natural difficulties they had to encounter, from the extreme cold, the snow, the ice, and the flooding of the rivers, that their progress was unavoidably tedious, and 3 years elapsed before they were enabled to reach a seaport town in the Lesser Armenia named Lyasus. Departing from thence by sea, they arrived at Acre in the month of April, 1269, and there learned, with extreme concern, that Pope Clement IV was recently dead. A legate whom he had appointed, named M. Tebaldo de Visconti de Piacenza, was at this time resident in Acre, and to him they gave an account of what they had in command from the Grand Khan of Tartary. He advised them by all means to wait the election of another pope, and when that should take place, to proceed with the object of their embassy. Approving of this counsel, they determined upon employing the interval in a visit to their families in Venice. They accordingly embarked at Acre in a ship bound to Negropont, and from thence went on to Venice, where Niccolo Polo found that his wife, whom he had left with charge at his departure, was dead, after having been delivered of a son who received the name of Marco and was now of the age of 19 years. This is the Marco by whom the present work is composed, and who will give therein a relation of all those matters of which he has been an eyewitness. In the meantime, the election of a pope was retarded by so many obstacles that they remained 2 years in Venice, continually expecting its accomplishment, when, at length, becoming apprehensive that the Grand Khan might be displeased at their delay, or might suppose it was not their intention to revisit his country, they judged it expedient to return to Acre, and on this occasion they took with them young Marco Polo. Under the sanction of the legate, they made a visit to Jerusalem, and there provided themselves with some of the oil belonging to the lamp of the Holy Sepulchre, conformably to the directions of the Grand Khan. As soon as they were furnished with his letters addressed to that prince, bearing testimony to the fidelity with which they had endeavoured to execute his commission, and explaining to him that the Pope of the Christian Church had not as yet been chosen, they proceeded to the before mentioned port of Lyasis. Scarcely, however, they had taken their departure, when the legate received messengers from Italy, dispatched by the College of Cardinals, announcing his own elevation to the papal chair, and he thereupon assumed the name of Gregory X. Considering that he was now in a situation that enabled him fully to satisfy the wishes of the Tartar sovereign, he hastened to transmit letters to the King of Armenia, communicating to him the event of his election, and requesting, in case the two ambassadors who were on their way to the court of the Grand Khan should not have already quitted his dominions, that he would give directions for their immediate return. These letters found them still in Armenia, and with great alacrity they obeyed the summons to repair once more to Acre, for which purpose the king furnished them with an armed galley, sending at the same time an ambassador from himself to offer his congratulations to the sovereign pontiff. Upon their arrival, His Holiness received them in a distinguished manner, and immediately dispatched them with letters papal, accompanied by two friars of the order of preachers who happened to be on the spot, men of letters and of science, as well as profound theologians. One of them was named Fra Niccolo de Vicenza, and the other Fra Guillermo de Tripoli. To them he gave license and authority to ordain priests, to consecrate bishops, and to grant absolution as fully as he could do in his own person. He also charged them with valuable presents, and among these several handsome vases of crystal to be delivered to the Grand Khan in his name, and along with his benediction. Having taken leave, they again steered their course from the port of Lyasis, where they landed, and from thence proceeded into the country of Armenia. He early received intelligence that the Soldan of Babylonia, named Bundokdari, had invaded the Armenian territory with a numerous army and had overrun and laid waste the country to a great extent. Terrified at these accounts and apprehensive for their lives, the two friars determined not to proceed further, and delivering over to the Venetians the letters and presents entrusted to them by the Pope, they placed themselves under the protection of the Master of the Knights Templar, and with him returned directly to the coast. Niccolo, Maffeo, and Marco, however, undismayed by perils or difficulties to which they had long been inured, passed the borders of Armenia and prosecuted their journey. After crossing deserts of several days' march and passing many dangerous defiles, they advanced so far in a direction between northeast and north that at length they gained information of the Grand Khan, who then had his residence in a large and magnificent city named Clemenfu. Their whole journey to this place occupied no less than 3 years and a half, but during the winter months, their progress had been inconsiderable. The Grand Khan, having notice of their approach whilst still remote, and being aware how much they must have suffered from fatigue, sent forward to meet them at the distance of 40 days' journey, and gave orders to prepare in every place through which they were to pass whatever might be requisite to their comfort. By these means, and through the blessing of God, they were conveyed in safety to the royal court. Upon their arrival, they were honorably and graciously received by the Grand Khan and a full assembly of his principal officers. When they drew nigh to his person, they paid their respects by prostrating themselves on the floor. He immediately commanded them to rise and to relate to him the circumstances of their travels, with all that had taken place in their negotiation with His Holiness the Pope. To their narrative, which they gave in the regular order of events and delivered in perspicuous language, he listened with attentive silence. The letters and the presents from Pope Gregory were then laid before him, and upon hearing the former read, he bestowed much commendation on the fidelity, the zeal, the diligence of his ambassadors, and receiving with due reverence the oil from the Holy Sepulchre, he gave directions that it should be preserved with religious care. Upon his observing Marco Polo and inquiring who he was, Niccolo made answer, "This is your servant and my son." Upon which the Grand Khan replied, "He is welcome, and it pleases me much," and he caused him to be enrolled amongst his attendants of honor. And on account of their return, he made a great feast and rejoicing, and as long as the said brothers and Marco remained in the court of the Grand Khan, they were honored even above his own courtiers. Marco was held in high estimation and respect by all belonging to the court. He learnt in a short time and adopted the manners of the Tartars, and acquired a proficiency in 4 different languages, which he became qualified to read and write. Finding him thus accomplished, His master was desirous of putting his talents for business to the proof, and sent him on an important concern of state to a city named Horizon, situated at the distance of 6 months' journey from the imperial residence, on which occasion he conducted himself with so much wisdom and prudence in the management of the affairs entrusted to him that his services became highly acceptable. On his part, perceiving that the Grand Han took a pleasure in hearing accounts of whatever was new to him, respecting the customs and manners of people and the peculiar circumstances of distant countries, he endeavored, wherever he went, to obtain correct information on these subjects and made notes of all he saw and heard in order to gratify the curiosity of his master. In short, during 17 years that he continued in his service, he rendered himself so useful that he was employed on confidential missions to every part of the empire and its dependencies, and sometimes also he traveled on his own private account, but always with the consent and sanctioned by the authority of the Grand Han. Under such circumstances, it was that Marco Polo had the opportunity of acquiring a knowledge, either by his own observation or what he collected from others, of so many things, until his time unknown, respecting the eastern parts of the world, in which he diligently and regularly committed to writing, as in the sequel will appear. And by this means he obtained so much honor that he provoked the jealousy of the other officers of the court. Our Venetians, having now resided many years at the imperial court, and in that time having realized considerable wealth in jewels of value and in gold, felt a strong desire to revisit their native country. And however honored and caressed by the sovereign, this sentiment was ever predominant in their minds. It became the more decidedly their object when they reflected on the very advanced age of the Grand Han, whose death, if it should happen previously to their departure, might deprive them of that public assistance by which alone they could expect to surmount the innumerable difficulties of so long a journey, and reach their homes in safety, which, on the contrary, in his lifetime, and through his favor, they might reasonably hope to accomplish. Niccolo Polo accordingly took an opportunity one day when he observed him to be more than usually cheerful of throwing himself at his feet and soliciting on behalf of himself and his family to be indulged with his master's gracious permission for their departure. But far from showing himself disposed to comply with the request, he appeared hurt at the application, and asked what motive they could have for wishing to expose themselves to all the inconveniences and hazards of a journey in which they might probably lose their lives. If gain, he said, was their object, he was ready to give them the double of whatever they possessed, and to gratify them with honours to the extent of their desires, but that, from the regard he bore to them, he must positively refuse their petition. It happened about this period that a queen named Bolgana, the wife of Arghun, sovereign of India, died, and at her last request, which she likewise left in a testamentary writing, conjured her husband that no one might succeed to her place on his throne and in his affections, who was not a descendant of her own family, now settled under the dominion of the Grand Han in the country of Cathay. Desirous of complying with this solemn entreaty, Argan deputed three of his nobles, discreet men whose names were Ulate, Apuska, and Goza, attended by a numerous retinue as his ambassadors to the Grand Khan with a request that he might receive at his hands a maiden to wife from among the relatives of his deceased queen. The application was taken in good part, and under the directions of His Majesty, choice was made of a damsel aged 17, extremely handsome and accomplished, whose name was Hogaton, and of whom the ambassadors, upon her being shown to them, highly approved. When everything was arranged for their departure and a numerous suite of attendants appointed to do honor to the future consort of King Argan, they received from the Grand Khan a gracious dismissal and set out on their return by the way they came. Having traveled for 8 months, their further progress was obstructed and the roads shut up against them by fresh wars that had broken out amongst the Tartar princes. Much against their inclinations, therefore, they were constrained to adopt the measure of returning to the court of the Grand Khan, to whom they stated the interruption they had met with. About the time of their reappearance, Marco Polo happened to arrive from a voyage he had made, with a few vessels under his orders, to some parts of the East Indies, and reported to the Grand Khan the intelligence he brought respecting the countries he had visited, with the circumstances of his own navigation, which he said was performed in those seas with the utmost safety. This latter observation having reached the ears of the three ambassadors, who were extremely anxious to return to their own country, from whence they had now been absent 3 years, they presently sought a conference with our Venetians, whom they found equally desirous of revisiting their home, and it was settled between them that the former, accompanied by their young queen, should obtain an audience of the Grand Khan, and represent to him with what convenience and security they might effect their return by sea to the dominions of their master, whilst the voyage would be attended with less expense than the journey by land, and be performed in a shorter time, according to the experience of Marco Polo, who had lately sailed in those parts. Should His Majesty incline to give his consent to their adopting that mode of conveyance, they were then to urge him to suffer the three Europeans, as being persons well skilled in the practice of navigation, to accompany them until they should reach the territory of King Argan. The Grand Khan, upon receiving this application, showed by his countenance that it was exceedingly displeasing to him, averse as he was to parting with the Venetians. Feeling nevertheless that he could not, with propriety, do otherwise than consent, he yielded to their entreaty. Had it not been that he found himself constrained by the importance and urgency of this peculiar case, they would never otherwise have obtained permission to withdraw themselves from his service. He sent for them, however, and addressed them with much kindness and condescension, assuring them of his regard and requiring from them a promise that when they should have resided some time in Europe and with their own family, they would return to him once more. With this object in view, he caused them to be furnished with the golden tablet, or royal chop, which contained his order for their having free and safe conduct through every part of his dominions, with the needful supplies for themselves and their attendants. He likewise gave them authority to act in the capacity of his ambassadors to the Pope, the kings of France and Spain, and the other Christian princes. At the same time, preparations were made for the equipment of 14 ships, each having 4 masts and capable of being navigated with 9 sails, the construction and rigging of which would admit of ample description, but to avoid prolixity, it is for the present omitted. Among these vessels, there were at least 4 or 5 that had crews of 250 or 260 men. On them were embarked the ambassadors, having the Queen under their protection, together with Niccolo, Maffeo, and Marco Polo, when they had first taken their leave of the Grand Khan, who presented them with many rubies and other handsome jewels of great value. He also gave directions that the ships should be furnished with stores and provisions for 2 years. After a navigation of about 3 months, they arrived at an island which lay in a southerly direction named Java, where they saw various objects worthy of attention, of which notice shall be taken in the sequel of the work. Taking their departure from thence, they employed 18 months in the Indian seas before they were enabled to reach the place of their destination in the territory of King Argan. And during this part of their voyage, also they had an opportunity of observing many things which shall in like manner be related hereafter. But here it may be proper to mention that between the day of their sailing and that of their arrival, they lost by deaths of the crew of the vessels and others who were embarked about 600 persons, and of the 3 ambassadors, only one, whose name was Goza, survived the voyage, whilst of all the ladies and female attendants, only one died. Upon landing, they were informed that King Argan had died some time before, and that the government of the country was then administered on behalf of his son, who was still a youth, by a person of the name of Kiakato. From him they desired to receive instructions as to the manner in which they were to dispose of the princess, whom, by the orders of the late king, they had conducted thither. His answer was that they ought to present the lady to Kasan, the son of Argan, who was then at a place on the borders of Persia, which has its denomination from La Arbor Seco, where an army of 60,000 men was assembled for the purpose of guarding certain passes against the eruption of the enemy. This they proceeded to carry into execution, and having effected it, they returned to the residence of Kiakato, because the road they were afterwards to take lay in that direction. Here, however, they reposed themselves for the space of 9 months. When they took their leave, he furnished them with 4 golden tablets, each of them a cubit in length, 5 inches wide and weighing 3 or 4 marks of gold. Their inscription began with invoking the blessing of the Almighty upon the Grand Khan, that his name might be held in reverence for many years, and denouncing the punishment of death and confiscation of goods to all who should refuse obedience to the mandate. It then proceeded to direct that the 3 ambassadors, as his representatives, should be treated throughout his dominions with due honor, that their expenses should be defrayed, and that they should be provided with the necessary escorts. All this was fully complied with, and from many places they were protected by bodies of 200 horse, nor could this have been dispensed with, as the government of Kyoto was unpopular and the people were disposed to commit insults and proceed to outrages, which they would not have dared to attempt under the rule of a proper sovereign. In the course of their journey, our travelers received intelligence of the Grand Khan Hubla having departed this life, which entirely put an end to all prospect of their revisiting those regions. Pursuing therefore their intended route, they at length reached the city of Trebizond, from whence they proceeded to Constantinople, then to Negropont, and finally to Venice, at which place, in the enjoyment of health and abundant riches, they safely arrived in the year 1295. On this occasion, they offered up their thanks to God, who had now been pleased to relieve them from such great fatigues after having preserved them from innumerable perils. The foregoing narrative may be considered as a preliminary chapter, the object of which is to make the reader acquainted with the opportunities Marco Polo had of acquiring a knowledge of the things he describes during a residence of so many years in the eastern parts of the world. And that would be all for today. I'll see you all next time. See ya!